The concept of the third eye occupies a strange territory where ancient spiritual metaphor collides with actual neurobiology, and neither side of that collision fully acknowledges the other. Spiritual traditions from Hinduism to Buddhism reference the third eye as a gateway to higher consciousness, intuition beyond rational thought, perception of realities invisible to ordinary senses. Meanwhile, neuroscience identifies the pineal gland, a small endocrine structure deep in the brain, as the likely physiological correlate, though its actual functions involve regulating circadian rhythms through melatonin secretion rather than anything resembling mystical perception. The confusion arises because both frameworks are mapping something real but interpreting it through incompatible lenses. The spiritual interpretation treats subjective experiences of expanded awareness, intuitive knowing, or altered consciousness as evidence of an actual perceptual organ accessing non-physical realities. The scientific interpretation treats those same experiences as neurological events, shifts in brain state, changes in neurotransmitter activity, alterations in how sensory information gets processed and integrated, that can be explained without invoking anything beyond physical mechanisms. And the gap between these interpretations isn't just semantic. It reflects fundamentally different assumptions about what consciousness is, how perception works, and what counts as real. The appeal of third eye discourse, particularly in contemporary wellness and spirituality spaces, lies partly in its promise of direct perception that bypasses the limitations and distortions of ordinary thinking. Rational thought is slow, biased, constrained by what language can articulate and what social conditioning permits. Intuition, by contrast, feels immediate, holistic, unconstrained by the linear logic that dominates conscious deliberation. The idea that opening or activating a third eye grants access to this intuitive knowing without the hard work of developing discernment through years of experience has obvious attraction. It suggests a shortcut to wisdom. And the language used, opening, activating, awakening, implies that the capacity already exists within you, dormant, waiting to be accessed through the right techniques. Meditation focused on the space between the eyebrows, specific breathwork patterns, visualization practices, certain foods or supplements claimed to decalcify the pineal gland and restore its mystical function. The promise is that these practices will produce experiences, heightened intuition that proves accurate, meaningful synchronicities, visions or inner knowing, a felt sense of connection to something larger than individual consciousness. And people do report these experiences. The question isn't whether the experiences happen. The question is what explains them, whether the spiritual interpretation adds anything beyond what neuroscience and psychology already account for, and whether pursuing them leads to genuine development or just creates another form of spiritual materialism where collecting experiences becomes the goal. The pineal gland itself is tiny, weighing less than 0.2 of a gram in adults, and its primary, scientifically established function is producing melatonin in response to light-dark cycles detected via signals from the retina transmitted through the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. Melatonin regulates sleep-wake rhythms and broader circadian processes essential for survival, affecting everything from body temperature to hormone release to immune function. The gland's location deep in the center of the brain, equidistant from the two hemispheres, its connection to light regulation, and certain structural similarities to primitive photoreceptor cells in evolutionary precursors, led to its historical designation as a vestigial third eye in a literal biological sense. Some reptiles still have a parietal eye, a light-sensitive organ on top of the head distinct from their two primary eyes that serve similar circadian regulatory functions. The human pineal gland is what remains of that structure after millions of years of evolution repurposed for internal regulation rather than external light detection. None of this involves mystical perception, it's endocrinology. But the metaphorical resonance between, An eye that detects light and an inner eye that detects truth or higher realities proved too compelling for various spiritual traditions to resist, and over centuries the pineal gland became invested with symbolic and metaphysical significance that has nothing to do with its actual biological role. Descartes famously called it the seat of the soul, the point where mind and body interact, though he had no empirical basis for that claim beyond the gland's singular central location in an otherwise bilaterally symmetrical brain. The more interesting scientific question involves whether the pineal gland produces any psychoactive compounds beyond melatonin. There's been speculation, particularly following research by Rick Strassman in the 1990s, that the pineal might produce N,N-dimethyltryptamine, commonly known as DMT, a powerful psychedelic compound found in various plants and in trace amounts in mammalian tissue. Strassman hypothesized that endogenous DMT production might explain near-death experiences, mystical states, and certain spontaneous altered consciousness phenomena. The idea gained enormous traction in psychedelic and spiritual communities despite limited supporting evidence. Subsequent research has detected extremely minute concentrations of DMT in brain tissue, but the amounts are far too small to produce psychoactive effects, and there's no confirmed evidence that the pineal gland specifically produces it at levels sufficient to alter consciousness. The hypothesis remains speculative at best. More recent work has suggested that if endogenous DMT does play a role in consciousness, it might involve neuroplasticity and receptor activity at concentrations much lower than those required for the dramatic experiences associated with exogenous DMT use. But even these findings don't support the notion that activating your third eye through meditation or dietary changes is accessing DMT-mediated mystical perception. The mechanisms are far more complex, multifactorial, and not localized to a single gland, and the experiences people report from third eye practices likely have multiple overlapping explanations that don't require invoking endogenous DMT. Psychedelics. What people actually experience when they report third eye activation or opening varies considerably, but tends to cluster around certain recognizable phenomena. Increased sensitivity to light or to what gets described as energy in the environment. Pressure or tingling sensations between the eyebrows at the location of the sixth chakra or ajna center in yogic systems. Vivid dreams or spontaneous visual imagery during meditation. Heightened intuitive hunches that sometimes prove accurate and sometimes don't. Experiences of synchronicity, where external events seem meaningfully connected to internal states in ways that feel too precise to be coincidence. Enhanced emotional sensitivity and awareness of subtle interpersonal dynamics that others miss. Spontaneous insights about situations or people that arrive without conscious reasoning. None of these experiences require invoking mystical mechanisms. Focused meditation naturally produces measurable changes in brain activity patterns detectable via EEG and fMRI, including increased activity in prefrontal regions associated with attention and decreased activity in the default mode network associated with self-referential thinking. Sustained attention to a specific body location can create proprioceptive sensations through increased neural activity in somatosensory cortex regions representing that area. Practices that reduce habitual discursive thought patterns create space for associative and imaginal processes usually overshadowed by constant internal dialogue. And increased introspective attention makes people better at noticing subtle cues, micro-expressions, shifts in others' tone or body language, patterns in their own emotional reactions. These are real effects with real functional consequences, but they're explicable as shifts in attention allocation, changes in neural activity patterns, and enhanced sensitivity to information that was always present but habitually unnoticed. The spiritual interpretation adds a layer of metaphysical claims that you're perceiving actual non-physical realities, accessing universal consciousness, receiving information from dimensions beyond ordinary physical channels that aren't necessary to explain the phenomena, and introduce unfalsifiable assertions that can't be meaningfully tested or verified. The gap between scientific and mystical interpretations becomes starkest around the question of whether third eye experiences involve genuine perception of something external to the individual or are entirely generated internally by shifts in brain state. The mystical position holds that consciousness isn't fully produced by the brain. The brain is more like a receiver or transducer tuning into consciousness that exists independently. And practices like meditation adjust the tuning to access frequencies or dimensions normally filtered out by ordinary waking consciousness. From this view, third eye experiences are perceptions of real but non-physical dimensions of reality, and the information received is objectively valid guidance from higher sources, not just subjective mental phenomena. The scientific materialist position holds that consciousness is entirely produced by brain activity, an emergent property of complex neural processing, and third eye experiences are just the subjective correlates of altered neural processing patterns. There's nothing being perceived except the brain's own activity. Both positions are philosophical stances about the nature of consciousness, rather than conclusions derived purely from evidence. Neuroscience can show correlations between reported experiences and brain activity patterns, but correlation doesn't settle whether consciousness is produced by neural activity or merely associated with it. That's a metaphysical question, not an empirical one that can be resolved through observation. And the practical consequences of which interpretation you adopt are significant. If you believe third eye experiences grant access to genuine non-physical realities or higher intelligence, you might trust the insights and guidance that arise during those states as objectively true and act on them without additional verification. If you believe they're internally generated phenomena, you might treat them as potentially useful but requiring verification. Both positions are philosophical stances about the nature of consciousness, rather than conclusions derived purely from evidence. Neuroscience can show correlations between reported experiences and brain activity patterns, but correlation doesn't settle whether consciousness is produced by neural activity or merely associated with it. That's a metaphysical question, not an empirical one that can be resolved through observation. And the practical consequences of which interpretation you adopt are significant. If you believe third eye experiences grant access to genuine non-physical realities or higher intelligence, you might trust the insights and guidance that arise during those states as objectively true and act on them without additional verification. If you believe they're internally generated phenomena, you might treat them as potentially useful but requiring verification through other means before making important decisions based on them. A psychological reading splits the difference. It acknowledges that third eye experiences are subjectively real and potentially meaningful without requiring non-physical realities or mystical dimensions. From a depth psychology perspective, what people access during these states isn't external mystical information, but normally unconscious aspects of their own psyche. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, psychological structures and symbolic patterns shared across humanity through evolutionary inheritance and cultural transmission, provides a framework where intuitions and visions that feel like they're coming from beyond the self might actually be arising from deeper layers of the psyche not accessible to ordinary conscious thought. The symbols, archetypes, and insights encountered during third eye experiences would then be communications from the unconscious to consciousness, meaningful not because they reveal cosmic truths, but because they reveal psychological truths about the person's own developmental needs, unintegrated material, and the structure of their particular psyche. This interpretation validates the significance people find in these experiences while remaining agnostic about metaphysical claims. The question isn't whether you're perceiving the astral plane or downloading information from universal consciousness. The question is what psychological function the experience serves, what it's trying to communicate about your inner state or developmental trajectory, and how integrating that material affects your functioning and relationships. From this perspective, a vision during meditation that feels like divine guidance might be your unconscious using symbolic language to communicate what conscious thought has been unable to grasp or unwilling to acknowledge. That doesn't make it less valuable, it just changes how you work with it. One practical concern with uncritical adoption of third eye discourse is that it can become another form of spiritual bypassing, using mystical experiences and practices to avoid dealing with psychological issues that require sustained, difficult work. Someone who reports receiving guidance from their third eye about ending a relationship or changing careers might be accessing genuine intuitive knowing about what serves their well-being and development. Or they might be rationalizing what they want to do anyway by attributing the decision to a higher source that can't be questioned. Or they might be avoiding the harder work of examining why they're in dysfunctional patterns, what early attachment wounds are being replayed, what they're defending against, and what needs to change at a psychological structural level for different choices to become sustainably possible. The problem isn't with intuition itself. Intuition is real and often valuable. It's the rapid, unconscious processing of pattern recognition and accumulated experience operating faster than conscious deliberation can track. But it's not infallible. Intuition can be shaped by unexamined biases, trauma responses, wishful thinking, and psychological defenses just as much as it can reflect genuine wisdom. The problem is treating intuition as infallible guidance from a mystical source rather than as one data point among many that needs to be evaluated alongside rational analysis, emotional awareness, consideration of consequences, and input from trusted others who might see what you can't. People who over-rely on third-eye intuition often make impulsive choices that feel spiritually guided but lead to predictable problems they could have anticipated with more grounded assessment. Another significant issue involves the commercialization and appropriation of third-eye symbolism stripped from its original cultural and religious contexts. Hindu and Buddhist traditions that developed the concept of the Ajna chakra, or third eye, did so within comprehensive philosophical and ethical frameworks. Opening the third eye wasn't presented as an isolated technique for gaining intuitive superpowers or having impressive experiences. It was part of a long developmental path involving moral discipline, study under qualified teachers, sustained meditation practice, and gradual transformation of consciousness embedded in living lineages with centuries of accumulated wisdom about what works and what's dangerous. Contemporary Western adaptations often extract the appealing parts: direct perception, mystical experiences, claims of spiritual advancement, while discarding the difficult parts: ethical constraints, submission to traditional authority, years of unglamorous foundational practice, integration into a coherent worldview that encompasses all of life rather than just peak experiences. The result is a consumer approach to spirituality, where you buy a weekend workshop or follow a guided meditation app expecting to activate your third eye and gain enlightenment, with no recognition that the traditions these practices come from consider this approach not just misguided, but potentially harmful. The experiences you might generate through these decontextualized techniques aren't necessarily authentic expressions of spiritual development. They might be self-induced altered states with no lasting transformative effect, or worse, they might destabilize someone without the psychological resources or community support to integrate what surfaces. Working with these experiences responsibly, regardless of whether you adopt a spiritual or psychological interpretation, requires several practices grounded more in humility than in metaphysical certainty. First, any insight or guidance that arises during altered states, whether you frame them as third eye activation, deep meditation, intuitive knowing, or simply unusual brain states, needs to be tested against reality before being acted on with significant consequences. Does this insight hold up when examined in ordinary consciousness hours or days later? Does it align with what trusted others who know you well observe about the situation? Would acting on it produce outcomes you actually want when you think through the implications, or does it just feel spiritually significant in the heightened moment? Second, these experiences need to be integrated through sustained reflection, written processing, and probably conversation with someone who can help you think critically about what emerged. Integration isn't just remembering what happened or telling the story. It's translating whatever arose during the experience into concrete behavioral and relational changes in ordinary life, which is much harder and less glamorous than having the experience itself. Third, The practices that produce these states need to be approached with proper preparation, pacing, and support structures. Meditation practices that significantly alter consciousness can surface traumatic material that's been dissociated, destabilize psychological defenses that are serving necessary protective functions, or induce states that feel overwhelming or fragmenting without proper guidance and integration support. Jumping into advanced practices without adequate foundational work in basic mindfulness, emotional regulation, and psychological stability is like trying to lift very heavy weights without building basic strength first. You're likely to injure yourself psychologically rather than grow in the ways you intended. The practices themselves, if approached with appropriate caution and realistic expectations, can be valuable tools for developing aspects of awareness that contemporary culture systematically neglects. Learning to sit with attention focused on a single point for sustained periods trains concentration in ways that constant digital stimulation actively undermines. Developing sensitivity to subtle bodily sensations creates better interoceptive awareness, which correlates with emotional regulation capacity and decision-making that aligns with actual values rather than reactive impulses. Accessing imaginal and symbolic modes of processing provides perspectives that pure rationality misses, especially for questions involving meaning, purpose, or integration of contradictory truths. And creating space for material from the unconscious to surface allows examination of patterns and motivations that remain invisible when attention is constantly directed externally. None of these benefits require believing in non-physical realities or mystical dimensions. They're developmentally valuable regardless of metaphysical interpretation. The practice is focusing attention between the eyebrows during meditation while observing whatever arises without judgment or attachment. The interpretation is what you make of the experiences that occur, whether you frame them as opening a mystical organ of perception or as training attention and accessing normally unconscious material. Both interpretations can coexist. The danger is only in mistaking the interpretation for the experience itself, or in believing the mystical interpretation grants special authority that overrides critical thinking and grounded assessment. The paradox embedded in the initial framing that science and mysticism offer incompatible yet somehow related explanations for third eye phenomena resolves when you stop trying to collapse them into a single account and instead recognize them as addressing different levels of description that can coexist without conflict. Neuroscience describes the physical mechanisms, neural activity patterns, neurotransmitter function, brain region activation and deactivation during various states. Phenomenology describes the subjective experience, what it feels like from the inside, the qualities of awareness, the content that arises in consciousness. Depth psychology describes the psychological function and meaning, what the experience reveals about unconscious material, developmental needs, or integration work that's attempting to occur. Spiritual frameworks describe the metaphysical interpretation and broader cosmological significance the experiencer attributes to what happened based on their worldview. All of these descriptions can be simultaneously true at their respective levels, without any one invalidating the others. The conflict arises only when one level claims exclusive explanatory authority or tries to reduce all others to its own terms. Reductive materialism insists only neural mechanisms are real and everything else is epiphenomenal illusion or folk psychology. Spiritual absolutism insists only mystical perception is real, and neuroscience just describes the physical vehicle without touching what's actually important about consciousness. Both positions are overreaching beyond what their methodologies can actually support. The more useful stance acknowledges that human experience is irreducibly complex, operating simultaneously at multiple levels. Levels: biological, psychological, social, existential, and, for those who find it meaningful, spiritual, and that complete understanding requires integrating insights from all of them without forcing premature unification into a single framework that inevitably distorts something essential about the multidimensional phenomenon being examined.